Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my podcast series devoted to the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. Please don't forget to like what you hear and hit subscribe. I have such sights to show you. The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. By the mid-1930s, the horror film was in a virtual coma, killing time between its initial fever of box office excitement that began with Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein through a gradual slump until revitalization again in 1938, thanks to the surprise hit double bill pairing of the two by an enterprising cinema owner in New York. There were sporadic twitchings of life, though, such as The Mummy and the impressively consistent run of splendid James Whale-directed films. After Frankenstein, he had continued to develop his signature combination of horror and dark subversive humor in The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and then his crowning achievement in the genre, The Bride of Frankenstein. This was to be his swan song in horror, and many fans, including myself, regard it as one of the very greatest horror films of all time. The success of the original Frankenstein seemed to demand a sequel even before its release. Such was the positive feedback from the Santa Barbara preview that Universal hastily added a rushed ending to allow Henry Frankenstein to survive. The studio had wanted to put Boris Karloff into a sequel called Return of Frankenstein, based on a treatment by Tom Reed, going so far as to design posters for it. The title was kept until the actual sequel began. Whale was resistant to being involved, having felt he'd already fulfilled his intention with the first film. He said, "I squeezed the idea dry on the original picture and never want to work on it again." He was persuaded back so long as he could exercise personal control over the screenplay development, credited to William Hurlbut and John L. Balderston and many of its ideas. The Shelley prologue and bottled miniature people are his, for example. The path to Hurlbut and Balderston's eventual version was almost as convoluted as that of The Invisible Man, and the problem was solved similarly by reverting to clues in the source novel. En route, there were several scenic stops, including the temporary return to the fold of Robert Florey, who offered a 7-page treatment with the unwieldy penny dreadful title The New Adventures of Frankenstein, The Monster Lives. However, the irksome director made such a liability of himself in claiming untrue authorship of the first film, and difficulties for Lemley Jr. on Murders in the Rue Morgue, that his ideas were disregarded. Another iteration by L.G. Blockman had Henry and Elizabeth as traveling carnival folk, who are threatened by the monster into creating his mate. Philip MacDonald came up with the entertaining notion of Henry inventing a death ray that he hopes the League of Nations will buy, and ends up using this to zap the offending creature. Even the reliable R.C. Sheriff took a whack at a script, but could never muster up enough genuine enthusiasm. There were so many development drafts that the one finally submitted to PCA, the Breen Office of Censorship, was a Frankenstein patchwork in itself, for which Universal had to apologize as it was the only complete one available. In writer Paul M. Jensen's later interview with Elsa Lanchester, who played the bride, she told him that amongst the credited ideas, it was Whale who insisted that she play both Mary Shelley and the bride. These performances not only create well-crafted bookends to the film, but a clever dramatic device tying the bride so closely to her literary parent. The prologue is a treat of an opening, drawing together the story's heritage with its modern cinema telling. Mary Shelley conceived the novel during a holiday stay at Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva in 1816, as part of what became a remarkable powerhouse foursome of literature gathered together. Lord Byron and her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley were already poets of great acclaim. Mary Shelley was yet to begin her writing career, and Byron's friend Dr. John Polidori would go on to publish his short tale The Vampire, the very first mainstream vampire story published that same year. In Bride of Frankenstein, we bypass the bet that inspired the original filmed novel in favor of a neat introduction to the sequel, well directed and characterized despite the scene's brevity. Gavin Gordon's Byron is an excellent preening peacock, darkly revelling in the public's condemnation of him as England's greatest sinner, fruitily rolling his R's and inevitably eclipsing Douglas Walton's milquetoast version of Percy. Whale's point in the prologue was to suggest that beautiful people are just as capable of wicked thoughts as those less prepossessing. Elsa Lanchester imbues Mary with the requisite beauty and a formidable self-possession that easily holds her own with the menfolk. A montage covers the first film, and then she invites her friends, minus the absent Polidori, to hear what happened next. The narrative timeline that follows is interesting. Whilst Bride picks up so closely from the end of the original Frankenstein film that the burnt-down windmill of the climax is still smouldering, it backtracks just enough to show Colin Clive's Henry Frankenstein being retrieved from the wreckage. The debris is surveyed with shrill-voiced shrewishness by that most combatively vivid villager from The Invisible Man, Una O'Connor, as Minnie, a favourite of Whale's rep company of regulars. She undermines the authority of the burgomaster in the form of another favoured player from that movie, E. Clive, a specialist in nincompoops of authority. There's a brief glimpse as well of Karloff's monster emerging from his encasement in a wall of mud to save a villager, but more of him later. By showing Henry's rescue, Whale expands on the hurriedly filmed ending of Frankenstein, which merely showed him bedridden in a long shot, due to a last-minute decision forced on him by Universal to not kill the scientist off. Henry is doted on by his wife Elizabeth, an impressively mature, if stagey 17-year-old Valerie Hobson, who replaced May Clark. She is concerned for her husband, whose post-traumatic stress has him tossing in your delirium. Henry expresses regret at his insane god complex of tinkering with life. Perhaps death is sacred, and I have profaned it. Clive's heartfelt sentiment could also be a mouthpiece for the censor here, who was hugely vexed by the perceived quasi-blasphemousness in the first film. Never fear, though, for the slumbering body of this sequel is about to be injected with an all-new treatment, courtesy of Henry's old mentor Dr. Septimus Pretorius. The name alone reeks of Victorian Gothic, and embodied by Ernest Thesiger, he is a splendidly camp queen of a gentleman, severely waspish and bearing a permanent lofty sneer at the world. Though allegedly Claude Rains and Bela Lugosi were considered, Thesiger is prissy perfection in the part, and in real life was Whale's own mentor from his theatre days. It was from Thesiger that Whale learned how to reinvent himself, using elocution lessons to rid him of his limiting West Midlands Dudley accent, in much the same way as Ernest Thesiger did with his own working-class tones, leading both actors to a wider range of parts and greater success. Pretorius is a terrific component in Bride, as he allows Henry to have his experimental cake and eat it. By blackmailing Henry into continuing his work, it allows the protégé to writhe on the hook in moral torture, Clive's most compelling actor quality, whilst appealing to his still-burning desire to perfect the rejuvenation of dead tissue. Under the guise of a coerced seduction of Henry's vulnerable mad scientist, Whale must have relished the chance to throw blasphemy in the face of Joseph Breen, head of the Hayes office. The production code of censor approval was in full effect now, forensically combing through Hollywood films for anything remotely controversial, which made something of a game for the director. His subversive side enabled Henry to get away with the almost messianically hot, "It may be that I am intended to know the secret of life. It may be part of the divine plan." Even when the Breen office forced a line change, there were still ways to convey the underlying meaning. At script approval stage, they vetoed Pretorius's intended "follow the lead of nature or God, if you like your fairy tales," with the less incendiary "if you like your Bible stories." But Thesiger caps the line with such scorn it has the same derisory effect even in censored form. Later, there is even a toppling of religious iconography in Karloff's knocking over of a graveyard bishop's statue, not to mention the monster being imbued with Christ-like suffering, if you're inclined to read it subtextually that way. Pretorius trumps the shadowy grandeur of his entrance with an illustration of his perversely cruel nature. and a touch of Whale's offbeat sense of humour. The mythical miniature characters under glass that he has bred. They are a parade of satirized icons mostly of the fairy tale world. The greedy king, the queen, the widow's peaked Lugosi-esque devil, the mermaid, and for sheer mischief, an archbishop. All are parodied in their pantomime gesturing and pipsqueak voices, the special effects pulling off a smooth transition as the king is lifted with tweezers by Pretorius and dumped back into his own jar. We then switch focus to Karloff's creature, now free and roaming the countryside, a superbly realistic studio backlot set, of which Whale was justifiably proud. He lumbers through the forest in search of the basic needs of everyone: food, shelter, and companionship. He finds none of the first two with the frightened gypsies, but strikes lucky at the home of a hermit, HOHC. Here, Whale's great taste in always selecting the right actor for the part paid off handsomely. Such was his belief in the difference this Australian actor's talent would make, that upon hearing Heggie was filming elsewhere for RKO, Whale shot around him on the creation scene, the prologue, and then shut down production for 10 days till Heggie was ready. The relationship between the hermit and the creature is indeed another of the celebrated highlights of the film, and well worth the wait in filming. The tenderness of Heggie's kindness towards the creature is very moving, not least for its utter lack of irony or condescension. The blind old man finds a kindred spirit in Karloff's fellow outcast, offering the comforts of his soup, wine, and cigar, the only person ever to recognize the monster's inner humanity. It is a clumsy negotiation between them, and all the more touching for Heggie's soothing of Karloff's fear of fire, and the disarming directness of their mutual understanding. Alone. Bad. Friend. Good, grunts Karloff, his deep rumbling utterances somehow ennobling him. Karloff always had misgivings about giving voice to the monster, fearing it would detract from the poetic mystique of his performance, and although it was a device never used again, here its beguiling simplicity of expression gives extra poignancy. The scene also contains an example of Franz Waxman's finely judged music score, delicately adding a biblical, saintly atmosphere to the hermit and his guest. Such is the scene's depth that even when lovingly pastiched by Gene Hackman and Peter Boyle in Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein, "Wait, I was going to make espresso," the affection for the relationship is still evident. Look out for a very young John Carradine as one of the hunters who cruelly breaks up the temporary friendship. It is no coincidence that The Bride of Frankenstein brings two misfits together like this. Indeed, all of the film's principal players, barring Elizabeth, fit that description, whether by circumstances, as these two must endure, along with Lanchester's bride thrust into the world, or inner direction. Pretorius and Henry Frankenstein's transgressive scientific views render them apart from the mainstream world. Whale had an innate sympathy for those who are different, living himself as a gay man in a prejudiced society. On the subject of comforts, Boris Karloff was now enjoying some influence in his career. The lowly Universal contract player who shot to fame just 4 years before as the mad scientist's offspring was exerting a star's persuasion, not only on behalf of the Hollywood actors community in his sterling work for the New Screen Actors Guild, but on a personal level he negotiated to reduce the punishing hours for himself, spent undergoing the makeup every day for the monster, whilst the time-consuming layering on of cotton and collodium by resident genius Jack Pierce still apparently took 4 hours a day to apply. Karloff was given a single-piece rubber forehead as a shortcut. His new prosperity had also generously accorded him a slightly more well-fed look than the cadaverous face of 1931. So his appearance was rounder. The aftermath of the mill fire shows in the burns Pierce applied to his hands and face and crew-cut hair, which gradually grows more over the evolving story. The great cinematographer John J. Mescal was another of Whale's long-standing collaborators who used clever lighting techniques to enhance Karloff's actually blue-green skin tones provided by Pierce. Film historian Scott McQueen discusses this in She's Alive, Universal's informative Bride documentary. If the monsters were filmed wearing this shade of grease paint on orthochromatic film, with blue gel light he would read as dead white. To increase the contrast, red was mixed with the other actors' makeup sharing scenes, and train warmer lights on them, thus recreating that all-important walking corpse veracity. Mescal was renowned for his overall shooting style, nicknamed Rembrandt lighting, simulating the great painter's work by using a central light with cross lights from opposing directions to add almost three-dimensional contours to faces, as well as Charles Hall's wonderful sets. Pretorius's shadowy first entrance is a memorable example. Another surprising meeting of minds in the film is the first encounter between Pretorius and the monster. Thesiger sits eating and drinking at night in the cemetery vault, using a coffin as a table for his bread and wine. The candlesticks and skull decor add a darkly funny Gothic tinge, as he guffaws at the world between mouthfuls. When Karloff appears, the sequence becomes an imitation of the hospitality he has just enjoyed. Indeed, Pretorius greets him with the amusingly unruffled composure of a new travelling companion. "I thought I was alone. Good evening." What the monster doesn't know is that a hidden agenda bubbles away now inside his new host, one that will use the creature as leverage to force Henry into creating a female version of the revived dead. This brings us to the famous climax of the movie, as the bride is unforgettably brought into the world. Charles Hall's high-ceilinged set for the laboratory is magnificent, showcasing the return of Kenneth Strickfaden's astounding equipment, such as the cosmic diffuser and the awesome spiraling coil that connects the lightning above to the stretcher bearing Lanchester to the heavens. Her birth is sensational. "She's alive! Alive!" crows Clive, even more effusively than when he created her male suitor. As with the casting of Frankenstein's original monster, the choice of Elsa Lanchester was delayed until filming began, here 8 days into the shooting. So important and specific was it to find exactly the right actor. So both the prologue and climax were moved to the end of the schedule. Nevertheless, when Lanchester's bride enters imperious, she is a queen, gowned in flowing white before her subjects, taking the space with an unforgettable regal power. Her scorching appearance is dramatically enhanced by her Nefertiti white-streaked hair locks streaming back across her natural brunette tresses, built around a hidden wire cage for extra vivid scale. The actor gifts her role with memorable details, the bird-like gaze flitting about her in wonder, staring up at the moonlight. Then comes the awful moment of truth, as she surveys Karloff and emits a silent, almost feline yowl of disgust. "She hate me, like others," the monster poignantly utters before literally bringing the house down with one of the great epic horror movie closing lines. "We belong dead." Lanchester hisses with venomous defiance and is gone, a truly stunning performance that resonates beyond her incredibly brief appearance, no more than 5 minutes, into the history books as the most vivid female horror character ever represented. Before the castle detonates, this section of the film is also appreciable for Waxman's music cues. There are effective stings that augment the mood, the lone drum that imitates the heartbeat of the comatose bride, and the grotesque parody of wedding bells as she stands triumphantly alive. The composer was careful to attribute evocative leitmotifs for each character, even to remind us of them when off-screen. Elizabeth's romantic melody, the monster's da-da-da-da that replicates his growl, and the graduating violin shiver when Pretorius lurks. In advance of its release, there were roughly 15 minutes of scenes excised from Bride. Elsa Lanchester's cleavage was considered revealing enough to warrant judicious edits to the prologue, but the main bulk of cuts consists of an entire 10-minute subplot involving Dwight Fry as the nervy criminal body snatcher Carl. To boost audience sympathy for the creature, Whale filmed a whole section whereby Carl kills his aunt and uncle and attempts to frame the monster for the murders. Ultimately, the sequence proved an unnecessary hindrance to the pace and was dropped. Fry would still have been grateful to Whale's characteristic loyalty, though. Carl was a composite of various parts rolled into one by the director, to give his admired friend more screen time in the rest of the film. We still have the pleasure of his jittery defense for procuring the bride's corpse. It was a very fresh one. The final release print of the film is masterfully edited by Ted Kent, leaving no fat in its prime-cut 75 minutes. It came in 10 days over its 36-day schedule and $100,000 over its $293,750 budget. But the box office business from its April the 19th release in 1935 was well worth it. In spite of the great success of The Bride of Frankenstein, the increasing burden of debt was too great to save Universal from being sold a year later to new owners who lacked any artistic taste or ambition. Boris Karloff showed the wise career judgment which may have eluded his contemporary Bela Lugosi in only agreeing to one more sequel as the monster, Son of Frankenstein, in 1939. He foresaw the descent into bad jokes and worse sequels. The lack of Whale's input made the law of diminishing returns an inevitability as the franchise wagon rolled on. The success of The Bride of Frankenstein was ultimately bittersweet to its director as well. Although it led to Whale being granted his first $1 million budget to realize a second studio attempt at the epic musical Showboat, he later became disillusioned with the industry. The new studio owners rewarded him for the musical's windfall and previous bonanzas by palming him off with decreasing budgets and schedules to force him into quickly fulfilling his current contract so they could get rid of him. Even though he handled these assignments with speed and some surprising success on those terms, several years later, after the failure of The Road Back, his sequel to All Quiet on the Western Front, he enjoyed a comfortable retirement before suffering debilitating strokes that caused him to commit suicide in 1957. He never lived long enough to enjoy the great critical reappraisal of his contribution to cinema, and horror especially. Bill Condon's affectionate biopic movie Gods and Monsters in 1998 goes some way to pay homage to James Whale's talent and sensibility decades after his life, as we shall see. Stay tuned for my next episode. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you've just heard, don't forget to click so, and please hit subscribe. If you build it, they will come.